Hello there, this is Mrs. Fendrick. I like that you decided to join me today. If you like math or science, especially geometry or computational thinking, I believe that you're going to like this lesson. It's a chance to be creative and no punctuation is required.
Welcome to a lesson about Fibonacci poetry. Your goal today is to be able to write Fibonacci poems. You are going to need some paper and something to write with so that you can write a few notes down during this presentation. When you see this picture of a pencil and paper, you will know that it is important to write down what you see on the screen. These notes will be helpful later when you write your poem. Leonardo Fibonacci was an Italian mathematician back in the Middle Ages. He came from Pisa. Here's the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which you can still see today if you go to Europe, to the country of Italy. Some people say that on a map, the country of Italy is shaped like a long boot. Mathematicians have known for a long time how Fibonacci's work applies to spirals that occur in nature. Even your eardrums are in the shape of spirals. Notice how the spheres or circles become wider as they circle out from their origins. We're going to begin with a quick vocabulary lesson. Here are some books that represent the genre known as poetry. Can you define poetry? One definition might be that poetry is rhythmic or musical language that expresses emotion. If you've ever learned about poetry, you've probably come across the term free verse. Can you define this one? Free verse refers to poetry that does not rhyme. You will have the choice in your Fibonacci poetry to decide whether you would like the lines to rhyme or whether you would like to use free verse. What about this powerful word, describe? Can you define what it means? Describe means to tell all about something, using sensory language to create a picture with words in the reader's mind. What is sensory language? Sensory language is also called imagery. It involves writing while keeping in mind the 5 senses. So, the writer needs to describe how things look or what he or she wishes the reader to see in his or her mind. The writer also needs to describe what is heard. And sometimes writers will write about how things smell. Writers also often describe feelings or emotion or the way things feel to the touch. Sometimes writers describe how things taste. Poetry usually includes sensory language or imagery. Now this word, sequence, is important for what you are doing with Fibonacci poetry. Do you remember how to define it? A sequence is an order, pattern, or set of related events that are arranged one after another. An example of this would be the sequence of grades that you go through in school, such as kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, and so on, up through middle school and high school until you graduate. Another way to think of sequencing would be like chapters in a book. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, Chapter 4, and so on. Fibonacci invented a sequence that is associated with him that he wrote down many years ago. The Fibonacci sequence refers to a series of numbers where a number is found by adding up the two numbers before it. You will want to write this down. For example, start with 0 and then a 1. To find the next number, I would say 0 plus 1 equals 1. If you go back before that number 1 to the first one, I'd say 1 plus 1 equals 2. And I need to go back to the number before the 2 and say 1 plus 2 makes 3. And then I'll go back and I'll say 2 plus 3 equals 5. And if I go back again, I'll take the 3 and add it to the 5 to come up with 8. Can you figure out what the next number in the Fibonacci sequence will be? It's 13. I know that because we stopped with 8, so I go back and I add 5 plus 8 to get 13. Can you figure out the next number in the Fibonacci sequence? It's 21. 8 plus 13 is equal to 21. What about the next number? Can you do that one? The answer is 34. How is the Fibonacci sequence used? As I said, mathematicians have noticed how it applies to spirals that appear in nature. This is the golden spiral. To visualize how this applies to a spiral, we can first consider it geometrically by looking at quadrilaterals or rectangles. This whole entire shape is called the golden rectangle. Remember our sequence. We started out with a 1, and we add another 1, which makes 2. And we go back and say 1 plus 2 is 3. And we go back before the 3 and say 2 plus 3 equals 5. And then 3 plus 5 equals 8. 5 plus 8 equals 13. And then 8 plus 13 equals 21. So it's another way to visualize the sequence. Mathematicians then overlay this golden rectangle with a spiral shape. This is called the golden spiral. Sometimes it is represented by the Greek letter phi. A Fibonacci poem uses this sequence 1, 1, 2, 3, and so on. As you write that many words per line, let's see what this looks like. Here's a Fibonacci poem. It's titled Word Crunching by an anonymous author. Notice here that our first number in the Fibonacci sequence is a 1, and it's associated with the number of words in the first line, and that is only one word, I. The next line continues the sequence with the word wrote. The 2 in the Fibonacci sequence comes next and is associated with this line that has two words, a poem. So right now it reads, I wrote a poem. And then we have three words on the next line. It says on a page, which is associated with the 3 in the Fibonacci sequence. The next number in the sequence, of course, is a 5. And so then the next line too has 5 words that say, but then each line grew. The poem continues in this way and says, by the word sum of the previous 2, until I started to worry at all these words coming with such frequency, because as you can see, it can be easy to run out of space when a poem gets all Fibonacci sequency. Now, as you know, the poet started with the 1, with one word, and worked through all the numbers in the Fibonacci sequence so that the final line has 21 words. If you count them all, you will see that there are 21 words here in the last line. That is how to write a Fibonacci poem. You use the number of words per line associated with Fibonacci's sequence. The easiest way to do it is to draw the number of blank lines associated with each number in the sequence. So, for the number 1, I would draw one line so that I could fill it in with the word, and so forth, all the way down. Here's a draft of a poem that has been started. It's simply a matter of filling in the blanks and continuing here. But there's another way to do it. Another way to write a Fibonacci poem is rather than having each line associated with the number of words in the sequence, I could instead go with syllables and do it with the number of syllables per line associated with Fibonacci's sequence. Do you remember how to define syllable? Here's the definition of syllable. It's a single unit of speech, or maybe you learned it by calling it a beat. Alphonse Davis was an African-American pilot during World War II and the first Tuskegee Airman from Nebraska. How many syllables are in his name? Alphonse Davis. Alphonse has 3 syllables and Davis has 2 syllables, so there are 5 syllables in Alphonse Davis's name. You might want to see how many syllables are in your name. Here are some basic syllabication rules that might make it easier. Every syllable has one vowel sound, and the number of vowel sounds in a word equals the number of syllables. So back to this name, Alphonse Davis, there are 3 vowels here, A, here at the beginning, then an O, and then the final A. That means we can hear all 3 vowels, so there are 3 syllables there. In Davis, I can hear the vowel A and the short I, so there are 2 syllables in the name Davis. So the total number of syllables in Alphonse Davis is the same as the number of vowels. If you decide to write a Fibonacci poem using syllables per line instead of words, you can set it up the same way. Notice on this particular Fibonacci poem, it has a different sort of alignment. Instead of having the words centered on the page, the lines are aligned along the left-hand side, and all the lines begin from the left margin. Remember, you have a choice about rhyming too. This particular Fibonacci poem uses free verse. In fact, text alignment, rhyming, and punctuation is up to you when you are the poet. To make things easier in this Fibonacci poem, the numbers in the Fibonacci sequence have been written down the left side, and it starts out with the one-syllable word I. The word used in the next line has one syllable. Even though there are two vowels, the U and the E, only the first vowel is heard. The next line has two syllables, each with one syllable. So we have to live. The word live has that final silent E that doesn't count. So even though there are two vowels in the word live, there's only one syllable. Then we have three syllables in a box, followed by a line with 5 syllables of emptiness, and followed by a line with 8 syllables, and so on. Boredom, but as time passed, it was filled with furniture and happiness and became home. As I said, you will need a full-size sheet of paper to write a Fibonacci poem. I find it easier to turn my paper sideways, the horizontal way, because as you know, the Fibonacci sequence has numbers that get larger as you go along, and you're going to need to leave more room to write those longer lines near the end. For your Fibonacci poem, you should describe something using sensory language. You can use Fibonacci sequence to either format the poem by the number of words per line or format the poem by the number of syllables. Something you might describe would be in the room with you, perhaps, or maybe you could describe a special object that is meaningful to you in some way. Maybe you would like to describe someone you know or someone important to you. Or perhaps you would rather describe a memory or how you are feeling today. So you're going to write Fibonacci poems. Now I am going to explain a challenging option for you that involves advanced learning. As I said, the golden ratio of spirals is known as the Greek letter phi. Let's talk about that a little more in depth. As I said, we can more easily visualize Fibonacci's sequence by looking at it geometrically. So we're going to look at some quadrilaterals here. This first block is just a single by itself, and we will call it a 1-by-1 block. If you think about geometry class and recall quadrant 1 of a coordinate plane, the x-axis runs horizontally and the y-axis goes up and down here vertically. Blocks can be lined up with the left corner always at the origin, or 0, 0. And we will call this block 1, 1 because it's right here at the right corner, coordinates of 1 and 1. If I add another block to my first one, I create a 2-by-1 rectangle, and we call that because we have 2 blocks here lined up on the x-axis, and then it's 1 inch high on the Y. A 2x2 looks like this. 2 blocks on the x-axis and 2 on the y. If I add my 2x1 rectangle to the 2x2, it looks like this. And now I have a 2x3. 2 blocks here on the x and 3 on the y. What about this shape made of green blocks? What do I call this one? It's a 3x3. I have 3 blocks on the x-axis and 3 on the y. If I put all of the shapes together, there would be 5 blocks on the x-axis and 3 on the y. This is called a 5x3. The shape illustrates phi, or the golden ratio. The ratio of each pair of consecutive numbers in Fibonacci's sequence is approximately 1.61. You find that by taking the 5 from the long side and dividing it by the short side, 3, and you get 1.66, a ratio that is very close to phi, or 1.61. Here's the same configuration, only smaller. Let's add some more blocks to it and see what we have. We have 5 on the x-axis. So how many are on the y? There's 8. So we have a 5x8 rectangle here. We divide the longer side, the 8, by the shorter side, 5, to get the ratio of 1.60, which is even closer to phi, 1.61. So as you go along in the sequence, you will notice the ratio gets closer and closer to that golden ratio of 1.61. That golden ratio is used in art, design, architecture, geometry, science, music, finance, and even programming. So here's a challenge for you. You can research how the golden ratio, or what we call phi, is used in another subject. So in addition to language arts, where we are using the Fibonacci sequence to write poetry, how Fibonacci's sequence and the golden ratio is applied to other fields, such as these, can be part of your research. Now it's your turn to write Fibonacci poems.
That's all there is to it. Now go and write your own Fibonacci poetry. I look forward to reading them.